Comrades, let us speak plainly. The world in which we live is not natural, not inevitable, and certainly not guided by fairness. The so-called common sense that governs our thoughts, our laws, and our daily lives is nothing more than a veil and illusion crafted by those who hold power to justify their rule. It whispers to us that the hierarchy, the inequality, the endless toil, and the privation we endure are simply the natural order of things. But I tell you now, this common sense is the greatest instrument of oppression, the quiet handmaiden of capitalism, and the false consciousness that keeps the chains of domination secure. Consider the world of labor. You rise each morning, you toil through hours of fatigue, and yet, when you return home, your poverty is described as prudence, your exhaustion as necessity, your submission as responsibility. The ruling class, the owners of factories, banks, and land, present this as wisdom, as the law of human nature itself. They convince you that inequality is inevitable, that wealth is earned because some men are simply superior, and that poverty is the moral failing of the poor. This is the language of common sense, comrades, and it is the most cunning weapon wielded against us. It is ideology in its purest form, shaping perception, so that domination appears natural and revolt appears unthinkable. Examine the mechanisms of this deception. Capitalism transforms labor into a commodity, stripping the worker of the product of their own hands and selling it for profit. Yet common sense tells you that your wages are fair because they correspond to the market, as if human need and dignity were reducible to supply and demand. You are taught to accept the division of labor, the hierarchy of positions, and the unequal distribution of wealth as self-evident. And so, without resistance, the chains of your own exploitation become invisible, taken for granted, and even rationalized as virtue. But let us not be fooled. The very concept of common sense is class-bound. It is defined by those who profit from your labor, shaped by those who benefit from your submission. The wealthy speak of prudence, but they hoard obscene fortunes. They speak of competition, but they rig the rules in their favor. They speak of order, but it is an order built upon the suffering of millions. What appears as common sense is merely the reflection of their interests, polished to seem natural, inevitable, and unchangeable, and every time you internalize this, you become complicit in your own subjugation. The antidote to this lies not in idle reflection, but in consciousness. The proletariat, the working class, must awaken to the reality of its condition. The chains of ideology can be broken by knowledge, by analysis, and by collective understanding. Recognize that the divisions among us between skilled and unskilled, employed and unemployed, urban and rural are deliberate, designed to prevent unity, to prevent the wielding of true power by the masses. Recognize that the wealth you produce, the labor you provide, is the source of all value, and that it is stolen from you under the guise of wages. Comrades, we must rise, not as scattered individuals, but as an organized class. We must challenge the very foundations of this system that hides power behind common sense, exposing it for what it is, a structure built to serve the few at the expense of the many. Unite, for in unity lies strength. Organize, for in organization lies liberation. The bourgeoisie fears your solidarity, for they know that the moment the workers recognize their collective power, the edifice of oppression begins to crumble. This is the historical moment we face. The apparent inevitabilities, the comforting illusions of common sense are breaking under the weight of our shared labor and our common suffering. Do not be seduced by resignation, nor pacified by incremental reform, for these are the tools of the ruling class to prolong their dominance. Know that the path to justice, to freedom, and to human emancipation is forged not in compromise with power, but in struggle against it. The time has come to lift the veil, to see the truth hidden behind the lies, and to act. History is made not by those who accept common sense, but by those who challenge it. The wealth stolen from the many must be reclaimed by the many. The labor exploited by the few must serve the community, not profit. The human spirit, shackled by ideology and fear, must rise in consciousness, in solidarity, and in revolution. Comrades, awaken. Question the truth that has been imposed upon you. Reject the false inevitabilities. Recognize your collective strength. The power that hides behind common sense is not eternal, and it is not invincible. It is only as strong as the acceptance of those it oppresses refuse that acceptance. Organize, rise, and in the unity of your struggle, reclaim the world that has always belonged to the working class. Common sense is presented to us as the voice of reason, the quiet wisdom of everyday life, the unquestionable truths that guide behavior and social expectation. It is invoked in conversations, in schools, in the laws, and in media, appearing harmless, even necessary, like a neutral framework within which society operates. Yet beneath this veneer of neutrality, common sense functions as one of the most insidious tools of domination, shaping thought, masking exploitation, and naturalizing inequality. It is not born from experience alone, nor from the careful observation of life. As realities, it is deliberately constructed by those who control wealth, property, and power. The ruling class, who reap the benefits of labor without performing it themselves, shape common sense to serve their interests, embedding their ideologies so deeply within the consciousness of the masses that it appears self-evident. To accept common sense uncritically is to accept the structures that keep the working class in submission to consent to. A social order designed to extract value from labor while pretending that exploitation is a natural law, as fixed and unchangeable as gravity or the cycle of seasons. Every element of daily life is imbued with this ideological manipulation. From childhood, the worker is taught to accept hierarchy as ordinary, to internalize obedience as virtue, and to see personal failure as a moral defect rather than a product of structural oppression. Poverty is rationalized as imprudence or laziness, while wealth is celebrated as merit or superior talent. These narratives are presented as commonsensical truths, yet they are illusions carefully maintained to divide, distract, and pacify. By framing inequality as the natural outcome of individual action or innate ability, common sense obscures the social and economic forces that actually produce disparity. It tells the worker that the system is fair, that the rules are just, and that resistance is futile, conditioning minds to accept submission as reason and resignation as prudence. The economic structures of capitalism rely upon this ideological conditioning. The laborer produces value, yet the fruits of that labor are appropriated by those who do not labor, exchanged for profit, while the worker receives only a fraction of what they have created. Common sense disguises this theft as the natural operation of wages, market forces, and personal responsibility. It convinces the oppressed that their condition is the result of choice, skill, or morality, rather than the exploitation built into the very system that governs production and distribution. The wage, the contract, the paycheck are presented as evidence of fairness, masking the underlying reality that all value originates from labor, and that labor alone sustains wealth, power, and social hierarchy. Common sense transforms this theft into a self-evident fact, so that the exploited come to police their own subjugation, questioning not the structures of domination but their own. Actions and capacities. Ideology embedded in common sense is also crucial in preventing collective action. Division among workers, whether along lines of skill, race, gender, or regional identity, is normalized as ordinary and inevitable. Competition is glorified as natural, conflict is framed as personal rather than systemic, and solidarity is discouraged as impractical or irrational. The worker comes to see themselves as isolated, the struggle as individual, the oppression as unavoidable. Common sense teaches that resistance is risky, that protest disrupts order, and that the rewards of rebellion are uncertain, while the dangers are immediate and tangible. In this way, the ruling class ensures that the very people who hold the source of all wealth are taught to doubt themselves, to fear unity, and to accept inequality as a feature of reality rather than the product of deliberate human design. Understanding common sense as ideology is not merely an intellectual exercise. It is the first step toward liberation. The worker must perceive that what seems natural is contingent, that the rules governing society are constructed, and that the realities of poverty, wealth, and power are the results of deliberate social arrangements. By exposing the truth behind common sense, the working class can begin to recognize the collective strength it possesses, the capacity to challenge and overturn the structures that sustain domination. The veil of inevitability is lifted, revealing that the social order is not immutable and that the power it conceals can be confronted, reclaimed, and redirected to serve the majority rather than the privileged few. Comprehending common sense in this way transforms perception into action, observation into strategy, and awareness into revolutionary potential. It allows the exploited to see through the myths that justify their exploitation, to question the normalities that chain them, and to recognize that the very foundations of society are subject to change. When the laboring majority awakens to its collective strength, demands justice, and organizes to reclaim the wealth and dignity that has been systematically denied. The labor of the worker is the foundation upon which all wealth, all power, and all social life rests, yet under capitalism it is transformed into a commodity, stripped of its humanity and sold at a fraction of its true value. This process of commodification is the very engine of exploitation, the mechanism by which the ruling class extracts profit, while the laborer receives only a wage framed as fair and deserved. Every hour of toil, every ounce of skill, every moment of energy poured into production becomes a source of enrichment for others, while the worker is made to believe that this exchange is just, that the wage received corresponds to the effort expended, that the contract binding labor to employer is an equitable arrangement. But these are illusions carefully constructed to mask the theft of labor and to legitimize the social order that rests upon inequality. Labor is more than effort, it is the creation of value, the transformation of raw materials into goods and services that sustain society. Yet, in a capitalist system, the product of labor does not belong to the laborer. It is appropriated by the owner of capital, converted into profit, and reinvested to generate further accumulation. The worker, though indispensable to production, is alienated from the outcome of their own work, the result of their skill, their intelligence, their sweat, and their endurance is withheld, commodified, and transformed into a tool of power for those who need not toil themselves. This alienation is not a mere side effect, it is the deliberate design of the system. By separating the laborer from the product of labor, capitalism ensures dependence, reinforces hierarchy, and perpetuates the cycle of exploitation. The system further obscures this theft by presenting wages as fair compensation, a moral and economic justification for the extraction of surplus value. The worker is taught to equate money with justice, to see the paycheck as the rightful reward for effort, and to measure their own worth by the limited portion of value they receive. Meanwhile, the surplus created by the difference between the value produced and the wage paid is appropriated by the employer, who claims it as a legitimate reward for ownership rather than as the fruit of another's labor. This misrepresentation is reinforced by ideology, by law, by custom, and by culture, all of which frame exploitation as natural, inevitable, and even beneficial, concealing the systematic theft that underpins wealth and power. Exploitation is also maintained through the social construction of labor conditions. The worker's hours, the intensity of work, and the control over the pace of production are dictated not by necessity but by profit. Fatigue, stress, and even injury are normalized as part of the cost of living, framed as personal responsibility or the natural consequences of effort. Common sense tells the worker that their suffering is the price of opportunity, that endurance is virtue, that patience and obedience are necessary for eventual reward. Yet this suffering is no accident. It is embedded in the system precisely because it maximizes profit, because it disciplines the workforce, and because it instills resignation, ensuring that workers consent to conditions that serve the interests of capital rather than their own humanity. This exploitation is not only material but ideological. By convincing the worker that wages and conditions are fair, the system cultivates false consciousness, suppressing the recognition of shared interest and the potential for collective resistance. Workers may blame themselves for misfortune, envy their peers, or internalize hierarchies, failing to see that the source of their oppression lies not in personal failing, but in the structural appropriation of their labor. The very act of labor, which should be a means of fulfillment and self-expression, is transformed into a mechanism of control, ensuring that those who create society's wealth remain subordinated to those who own its instruments. Understanding the exploitation of labor is essential to any path toward liberation. It reveals the hidden architecture of power, the economic relations that shape social life, and the ways in which wealth is generated not by merit or skill alone, but by the organized effort of the working class. Recognition of this reality transforms perception into awareness, injustice into motivation, and passive endurance into revolutionary potential. The laborer must see that their wages are not a gift, that the system does not reward fairness, and that the conditions under which they toil are not accidents of circumstance, but deliberate instruments of domination. When the worker comprehends the truth of their exploitation, the possibility for change emerges. Collective understanding, solidarity, and organized action become not optional strategies, but the necessary means to reclaim the value stolen from labor. To challenge the system that commodifies human effort, and to create a society where the fruits of work serve humanity rather than profit. Exploitation is not eternal, and its power rests only in the consent of those it subjugates, which can be withdrawn when the working class awakens to its own strength, recognizes its shared stake, and unites to transform society itself. What we accept as normal, what we take for granted as rational, and what we perceive as self-evident in society is not impartial reflection of truth or reality, but a carefully constructed vision shaped by the interests of those who hold wealth and power. Class-bound perception is the lens through which social life is interpreted, and it is designed not to reveal reality, but to obscure it. The norms, values, and common sense that govern everyday life reflect the worldview of the ruling class, while the needs, experiences, and aspirations of the majority of the laboring masses are marginalized, dismissed, or rendered invisible. Society teaches us to see the world through the eyes of those who benefit from exploitation, to internalize their priorities as natural and inevitable, and to judge our own lives by standards that serve their accumulation of wealth rather than our well-being. From the moment of birth, the individual is socialized into this perception. Education, religion, media, and law present the existing order as rational and immutable, celebrating the wealth of the few while normalizing the deprivation of the many. Poverty is framed as a personal failing, not as the outcome of structural exploitation. Social hierarchies are portrayed as natural distinctions of talent, merit, or effort, masking the fact that these hierarchies are constructed to maintain power. The worker is encouraged to aspire to the standards set by those who prosper, to accept competition, and to internalize the idea that inequality is not only unavoidable but also just. The majority is thus compelled to view their struggles, limitations, and oppression as personal problems rather than systemic conditions, obscuring the very structures that create suffering. This distortion of perception extends into economics, politics, and social behavior. Economic policy is presented as neutral and rational, yet it is shaped to benefit capital, privilege property, and prioritize profit over human need. Tax codes, labor laws, and financial systems are framed as technical necessities, but they perpetuate inequality, favoring those with existing wealth while penalizing those without. Political institutions claim to serve the common good, yet their structures reinforce elite influence, suppress dissent, and validate social hierarchies. Media narratives define which lives, which achievements, and which behaviors are worthy of admiration or scorn, shaping public opinion to align with elite interests. In all of this, what seems reasonable, rational, or ordinary is constructed to serve one class while appearing natural and self-evident to everyone else. The consequences of class-bound perception are profound. By shaping what is considered rational or moral, The ruling class ensures that the working majority internalizes their own subordination. Workers come to judge themselves and each other through the lens of the privileged, measuring success by wealth, status, or individual achievement rather than collective well-being or social justice. Solidarity is undermined because those oppressed begin to accept the narratives of their oppressors, competing against each other instead of recognizing shared conditions and common interests. Resistance is stifled because the structures of power are presented as the only feasible arrangement, and imagination is limited by the framework of the powerful. People are taught to see constraints as natural limits rather than artificial boundaries imposed for the benefit of the few. Class-bound perception also obscures the mechanisms of exploitation. The labor that sustains society, the sweat and skill that generate wealth, is taken for granted, while the profits it produces are claimed as natural returns on capital. The worker's contribution is invisible in public discourse. The social value of labor is redefined according to the priorities of the wealthy. Consumption, production, and leisure are judged in ways that reinforce inequality, and the norms of society are used to justify disparities in education, opportunity, and access. In this way, the interests of the ruling class are not only preserved materially but embedded psychologically, shaping how people perceive themselves, their environment, and their possibilities for action. Awareness of class-bound perception is therefore a critical step in revolutionary consciousness. To see through the dominant lens is to recognize that the social order is not impartial, that the standards imposed as rational and normal serve the privileged, and that the realities of oppression are neither natural nor inevitable. Once the working class understands that what is presented as common sense reflects elite priorities rather than the collective needs of society, the foundation for solidarity and resistance emerges. Collective strength, organized action, and the reclamation of social narratives become tools to confront power, dismantle the illusions of normality, and reshape society according to the needs of the majority rather than the desires of the few. Recognizing class-bound perception transforms understanding into awareness, awareness into strategy, and strategy into action, allowing the working majority to reject the imposed norms that sustain their oppression, to challenge the values and priorities dictated by wealth, and to create a society in which reason, morality, and social reality are aligned with human need rather than the profit of the few. The awakening of collective consciousness is the foundation of liberation. It is not enough for the worker to toil, to endure, or even to perceive injustice in isolation. The realization of exploitation and the understanding of systemic oppression only acquire their transformative power when experienced collectively. Individual awareness may breed discontent, but discontent alone does not dismantle structures built upon centuries of inequality and hierarchy. The oppressed must see themselves as part of a class, as participants in a shared struggle, as bearers of a common interest that transcends personal circumstance. Without this consciousness, the laborer remains a solitary agent, isolated by ideology, division, and fear, and the mechanisms of domination continue unchecked, concealed by the illusion of natural order and the logic of common sense. Collective consciousness begins with the recognition of the structures of exploitation. The worker must understand that their suffering is neither a moral failing nor the result of individual weakness, but a systematic outcome of social, economic, and political arrangements designed to extract labor and consolidate wealth in the hands of the few. Each wage withheld, each hour of toil demanded, each law that privileges property over human need, is not accidental but intentional, part of a framework maintained through ideology, coercion, and consent. Once this reality is perceived, the laboring class can begin to see its shared stake in challenging the status quo. The recognition that oppression is structural rather than personal transforms resentment into purpose, frustration into direction, and isolation into unity. Solidarity emerges from this awareness. The worker who understands the mechanisms of exploitation cannot ignore the suffering of their fellow laborers, for the system that oppresses one also oppresses all. Division, whether based on skill, gender, race, region, or background, is revealed as artificial, constructed to prevent the recognition of shared interests. False hierarchies and competition among the working class are understood as tools of control, designed to fracture potential resistance and sustain domination. In acknowledging these divisions and their manufactured nature, the laboring majority can cultivate solidarity, aligning individual struggle with collective action. Consciousness, therefore, is not merely an intellectual realization. It is the bedrock of moral and strategic unity, allowing disparate experiences of oppression to converge into a common cause. The power of collective consciousness extends beyond awareness of exploitation. It fosters the capacity for organized action. Knowledge alone cannot liberate, for the ruling class controls the instruments of wealth, law, and coercion. Only through the conscious coordination of effort can the laboring masses translate understanding into change. Organization enables strategy, ensures mutual support, and amplifies the impact of resistance. Workers who recognize their collective strength can challenge institutions, disrupt economic hierarchies, and reclaim control over production, distribution, and social decision-making. Consciousness becomes the force that transforms the potential for rebellion into practical power, bridging the gap between understanding and revolution. This consciousness also disrupts ideology. The narratives that present inequality as natural, merit as just, and obedience as virtuous lose their hold once workers recognize that these are instruments of domination rather than truths of human nature. The myths of competition, the glorification of individual success, and the moralization of poverty are exposed for what they are, tools designed to divide, distract, and suppress. When workers collectively perceive these mechanisms, ideology loses its authority and the illusion of inevitability crumbles. The laboring class begins to see not only the oppression it endures, but also the means by which it can be resisted, the paths towards self-determination, and the structures that can be transformed in its own interest. The development of collective consciousness is inherently revolutionary. It allows the working class to define its own identity, establish its own priorities, and determine its own action. It transforms passive acceptance into deliberate engagement, despair into hope, and scattered discontent into coordinated struggle. Awareness of exploitation becomes a shared moral imperative, and the realization of common interest becomes the foundation for social transformation. Consciousness awakens the capacity to see the world not as it is presented by the powerful, but as it could be an arena in which labor serves humanity rather than profit, equality replaces privilege, and justice replaces subordination. Collective consciousness is therefore both shield and weapon. It shields the oppressed from the distortions of ideology, the illusions of inevitability, and the divisions imposed by the ruling class, allowing them to see their true position within society. It is a weapon because it concentrates understanding into power, aligning knowledge, organization, and solidarity toward a single purpose, the dismantling of systemic oppression. It ensures that rebellion is not sporadic, that revolt is not accidental, and that resistance is guided by the insight that the liberation of one is bound to the liberation of all, and the freedom of the many can only be achieved through the unity, awareness, and coordinated action of the working class. The liberation of the working class cannot be achieved through passivity, resignation, or hope for gradual reform. The structures that govern society, the economic and political arrangements that hide behind the veil of common sense, are fortified by generations of accumulation, legal authority, and ideological control. They are not fragile, they are deliberate, sustained, and self-reinforcing. To challenge them requires more than individual effort. It demands organized, united action, for only a collective force capable of confronting systemic power can dismantle the mechanisms that perpetuate exploitation, inequality, and oppression. The emancipation of labor is inseparable from the solidarity of those who labor, and the future of justice and freedom depends upon the conscious alignment of the many against the few who claim control over society's wealth. Revolutionary action begins with recognition and awareness. The working class must understand that their strength is inherent and vast, for all wealth, all production, and all social life are built upon their labor. The so-called inevitabilities of hierarchy, competition, and scarcity are artificial constructs maintained to justify domination and to conceal the theft of value. The capitalist system presents submission as rational, obedience as moral, and exploitation as natural, yet these are lies designed to prevent the realization of power by those who produce the material and social foundations of society. The moment the working class collectively comprehends the depth of its oppression, it gains the moral clarity necessary to challenge authority, the strategic insight to organize effectively, and the unity required to confront entrenched structures. Organization is the instrument through which consciousness becomes action. Scattered discontent, though powerful in emotion, is insufficient to overthrow a system designed to resist isolated efforts. Only through collective coordination, planning, and the alignment of efforts across workplaces, communities, and regions can the laboring majority transform awareness into transformative power. Unions, workers' councils, political associations, and grassroots movements are not mere institutions. They are the vessels of solidarity, the channels through which the energy of the many is concentrated and directed toward structural change. Through organization, the working class can wield its numerical and productive power to challenge ownership of capital, to assert control over the means of production, and to reorient society toward human need rather than private profit. Solidarity is the lifeblood of revolutionary action. The divisions sown by the ruling class between skilled and unskilled, employed and unemployed, urban and rural, and across lines of race or gender must be understood as artificial and intentionally imposed. These divisions weaken collective power and obscure shared interests. Only by forging unity across these distinctions can the working majority confront the apparatus of domination. Solidarity transforms the struggle from a series of isolated grievances into a coherent movement capable of systemic challenge. Each act of mutual support, each recognition of shared struggle, strengthens the capacity to resist and amplifies the impact of collective action, transforming individual suffering into a political force that cannot be ignored. The urgency of revolutionary action cannot be overstated. Capitalism does not pause to negotiate morality. It thrives on delay, distraction, and incremental concessions, always recalibrating to protect privilege. Temporary reforms, charitable gestures, or superficial adjustments cannot deliver emancipation, for the system's survival depends upon the preservation of inequality. The working class must recognize that only through decisive, organized, and united action can the mechanism of exploitation, the institutions of dominance, and the ideologies that legitimize them be dismantled. Revolution is not an abstraction or a distant ideal. It is a necessity, a historical imperative arising from the condition imposed upon labor, and it is achievable when the exploited understand the power they collectively possess. Action must be guided by strategy, awareness, and the principles of justice. It is not enough to revolt blindly or destructively. The aim of organized struggle is to reclaim control over society's wealth and to redirect labor toward human need, equality, and freedom. The seizure of power by the working class is both an act of justice and a means of liberation, breaking the cycle of exploitation, dismantling the structures that hide behind common sense, and establishing a society in which human potential can flourish without domination, scarcity, or coercion. Revolutionary action is therefore both defensive and transformative. It defends the dignity, lives, and labor of the oppressed, and it transforms society itself into a system where the majority can govern, produce, and thrive according to collective need rather than private accumulation. The call to revolutionary action is clear and unyielding. Awareness without organization is impotent, solidarity without strategy is fragile, and anger without direction is dissipated. The working class must unite, organize, and act with deliberate purpose, recognizing that its liberation is inseparable from the dismantling of structures of oppression, the exposure of false ideologies, and the assertion of control over production and society. It is in this unity, this conscious collaboration, and this decisive action that the oppressed will reclaim justice, freedom, and the full potential of their humanity. Comrades, the illusions that have bound us, the so-called common sense that has justified our suffering, and the structures that have stolen the fruits of our labor can no longer hold us in submission. We have seen how ideology masks exploitation, how perception is shaped to serve the few, and how our labor has been commodified while our value has been stolen. We have understood that awareness alone is not enough, that only through collective consciousness, solidarity, and organized struggle can the power of the working class be realized. The time for passive endurance is over. The labor of the many must no longer enrich the few in silence. The exploited must no longer be divided by artificial distinction. The chains of domination will break only when we unite, act with purpose, and assert our rightful claim to justice, freedom, and the wealth we ourselves create. History is not written by inevitability, but by the hands of those who recognize their strength and act upon it. The world we inherit can be transformed from one of oppression and inequality into one of shared prosperity and human dignity, but only if the working class rises together, organized, aware, and unyielding. Let us cast aside the false truths imposed upon us, reject the naturalization of our exploitation, and confront the powers that have hidden behind common sense for far too long. Our labor, our unity, and our consciousness are the instruments of revolution. It is through them that society will be remade, that oppression will be dismantled, and that humanity will finally take its rightful place as the master of its own destiny.